Welcome to the Ibiza Chill Out Lounge music. You've obviously all been up all night. It's been a big night, and there's nothing better than after a whole night's dancing to get into some really granular detail on the future of AI and global competitiveness in that space. That's what the good people in Ibiza Chill Out Lounges are doing, and we're going to do it here. I see some familiar faces, but also some that I don't know. My name's James Harding. I'm the editor of Tortoise. I suppose I just want to, before I introduce Joe and Serena, I just want to give you just some context of what we're doing and why we're doing it. When I was a correspondent for the FT in China, I remember going for a lunch, a very long lunch, with an Indian diplomat. And he said, you know, I've always wanted to be a journalist. It seems to me the job of journalism is to try and understand where the official reality is and where the real reality is, and just map that gap. And then about 15 years later, I went to go and see the guy running Nokia. And he said, oh, it's really interesting to me. I've always wanted to be a journalist. He says, the thing that I'm really interested in is there seems to be a circle, a public space of acceptance, and a box, which is where the laws and rules of society operate. And it seems to me as though your job as a journalist is to map the extent to which that circle sits within or outside of that box. And if you care, as we all do at Tortoise, about journalism, one of the things you're really trying to do is do those two things. Essentially map the gap between official and real reality, understand where the circle of public acceptance is vis-a-vis the box of laws and rules. And it's really hard. I think the truth is in our world it gets harder and harder, and in the news in particular, I'm looking at an old colleague of mine from the BBC, we really struggle with this because we're so drawn to events, we're so drawn to Titan submersibles that it can be really hard to understand these big changes that are happening over time. And so from the moment that we started Tortoise, we started recruiting incredibly thoughtful people who were willing to spend a long period of time trying to track big changes where they're about responsibility in large companies, big changes in terms of the footprint of the food and farming industry, but from the very start, AI. And what we tried to do, and it was my colleague Alexandra Musavizadeh who was the kind of initial drive with this, was to say, look, there's going to be a loud debate about ethics of AI. It's classic journalistic trope, which is, let's take the thing we don't understand and discuss the thing that we do, right? There's going to be a lot of discussion about either catastrophic Cassandra predictions of AI or miracle cures, and sure enough, we're seeing those. But actually, if we just try to track who's doing what on a country-by-country basis, we hope we'll see two things. We hope that we'll see the landscape of the 21st century being reframed in front of us, but also in the detail of the pillars, in the detail of the data, we'll see and understand the levers that have the capacity to change societies and public outcomes. So that was our thinking in creating the AI Index. And then our second brilliant idea was to get people like me far away from it and get people like Joe and Serena right directly involved in it. Joe White and Serena Cesario are the drivers of our AI index, by which I mean they collate the evidence, they look at the indexes, and they look at the methodology behind it. There's a team of other data journalists, many of whom I see here this morning, who've helped with it. But these two are the ones, I hope, who will help us understand exactly what the 2023 findings tell us. After that, I'm going to invite Richard, Catherine, and Tim up to talk about it and make sense of A, the findings, but B, what the hell's going on. And this is a newsroom. It's not a conference hall. It's not a place where everyone needs to sit and be polite. We hope over the course of the time we've got together, we'll hear from as many people as possible, things that you think we could be doing better, things that we think we should be looking into. But with that, Joe, Serena, tell us what the hell's going on.
Thank you, James. We are, in fact, very, very excited to finally be presenting the findings of the fourth iteration of the index to all of you. But first, it might be worth giving a bit of background as to what this index is and how it works. If we can have the first slide up. No, that's fine. Okay, so the Global AI Index was first launched in 2019 and really as a response to the need for greater clarity around the state of AI around the world. And now in 2023, like James was saying, this has even become more timely and more important. So what the index is really a ranking of 62 countries around the world, measured by their level of artificial intelligence capacity across 111 indicators that are spread across three different main pillars and 7 sub-pillars. So the first pillar is innovation. And innovation, we really look into both research and development. So this is, for example, the number of researchers or academic papers and publications, but also the contributions to the open source AI ecosystem. The second pillar is implementation, which looks at both talent, operating environment, and infrastructure. And talent is the human capital around AI. Operating environment includes metrics, for example, related to public opinion and the level of data protection regulation. And then infrastructure is both a mix of basic infrastructure like access to internet, but also more advanced infrastructure like supercomputers. Investment is the third pillar, and this is both intended as public spending and government efforts towards AI growth, but also the commercial ecosystem, so the number of AI startups and the level of funding that goes into them at a national level. And then one final thing to add here is that this index is a combination of both proportional and absolute indicators, so we call it a composite index. And this is, we will come back to this later, but it's important because what we're trying to do here is both looking at the level of scale of AI growth and AI capacity, so in absolute numbers, for example, the total number of data scientists that exist in a country. But also we look at the level of AI intensity growth. So this is measuring AI capacity relative to a country's size, both in terms of population and economy size. So we can go into the ranking table, and this is the ranking for 2023.
So yeah, so this is just the top 10. I think you can get sort of a full version in a nice spread in the booklet, but sort of to do the position. So, in first place, perhaps not that surprising, the United States. And the United States is sort of really leading in all three of these pillars. They sort of are sort of quite dominant. And particularly when it comes to sort of the commercial ecosystems, so sort of, AI startups and sort of big tech companies doing AI, the US are really dominant, sort of something like sort of just over 50% of all sort of AI private investment has gone to the US in the last few years. And that sort of 50% share has remained fairly stable, where actually China's share has sort of dropped quite a lot in the last few years. In second place, we have China. And so sort of we score all of these countries, and in the end, sort of the top country gets 100. And then sort of we score the other countries relative to that. So the US scores 100, China scores 62. And so that sort of shows there is quite a big gap actually still between them. China is really the only other country in the index that can sort of come close in some areas to the US. So, they are sort of second in innovation and investment. There are some indicators where China actually sort of surpasses the US. So sort of by raw numbers, like the total number of AI research publications, or sort of the number of sort of the biggest supercomputers. But if you sort of look at those raw numbers in a little bit more depth and sort of take a quality versus quantity, then actually, it looks more complicated. So China publishes the most AI papers, but actually the top papers, the ones that sort of make groundbreaking discoveries and sort of get cited, those are in the US. The US still have the most powerful and technologically sophisticated supercomputers. And then in third place, we have Singapore. And so Singapore is really here because it does so well in all of these what we call relative sort of proportional indicators. So, it's a small country, but sort of very, very concentrated hub for sort of AI activity and capacity, and sort of does quite well across the board on all those areas. And then in fourth, we have fourth and fifth, we have the UK, very closely followed by Canada. These have always been strong performers in the index and sort of continue to do well here.
Yeah, and then what we think with these kinds of tools is that they really are useful when we look at the changes over time. So what we really wanted to show here in the next slide is how the ranking has evolved across the past 2 iterations of the index. And you can see here that the US and China have kept first place and have always kept first and second place, since the launch of the index. And like Joe was saying, their performance in terms of scores hasn't actually changed that much compared to the 2021 iteration. But we have seen the gap between the US and China increase when it comes to private investment in AI companies. And China especially decreased dramatically from 29% as a global share of private investment going into AI companies in China. They've decreased to 10% in 2023, which is quite significant. But what really stands out, if we look at this graph, or it would stand out if it was in yellow, is the Singapore jump, which has been quite significant because it has moved from 10th place in 2020 to 6th place in 2021, and then again to 3rd place in 2023. And like Joe was saying, this is largely being driven by Singapore's performance on all the relative indicators, but also in absolute numbers. Singapore has made incredibly huge advancements on AI since the launch of their artificial intelligence strategy in 2019. And that has been across research, innovation, human capital. And this really makes Singapore one of the best countries to invest in AI, one of the most dynamic ones as well. And then we also see that the UK has dropped from 3rd to 4th place. And this has been really mainly because of Singapore's rise, because the UK's performance hasn't decreased that much, and the score has actually remained quite similar from the previous iteration. And the UK, for example, is the 3rd most attractive country for AI private funding still in the world. And then finally, the other countries that you see in gray, like Canada, South Korea, Israel, Germany, the Netherlands, and so on, I wouldn't read too much into the ranking changes for those, because the scores have always been so similar that any small change in the data will cause a change in the ranking. But all of them really are impressive countries, especially for their size, like Israel and Switzerland, for example.
And then if we can just go to the next slide. So something we've talked a bit about sort of how the index is a composite one. So it takes sort of both sort of absolute indicators and sort of per capita ones. And so something we've tried to do this year is to actually sort of break this down a bit and actually sort of score countries separately on sort of per capita or proportional to GDP versus absolute. And so we've got this here as sort of what we describe as scale, which is the sort of the absolute sort of AI capacity at sort of the global level, and then sort of intensity, which is sort of this kind of like how concentrated is AI activity. And so if we sort of look at how countries score there, so if you look at sort of the x-axis, you can see that in terms of scale, it's the big global players, the big economies that essentially do very well here. And so you have the US, China, the UK, you've got Germany below, that sort of dot below there, and India. And this isn't sort of too surprising in a sense. These are sort of the countries with big economies. And then if you look at this sort of cluster in the top left, these are the sort of countries that do best on intensity. So you have Singapore, Israel, Switzerland, you have Finland below there, and then sort of in between the UK and Switzerland, you have the South Korea and Canada. And so Singapore particularly, is really, really sort of high up. They are sort of, in a lot of indicators, they are the top in per capita, whether it's in research, development, investment. And actually sort of the reason they score sort of third on the index is they are sort of driven up by their sort of intensity score. Something that's worth noting is actually, the US leads on scale, but actually is also quite good at intensity. So they come 5th in intensity overall, which is sort of, it's not just size, it's actually, there is a lot of concentrated activity going on there. And then Singapore still ranks 10th in scale. So again, like they are sort of outperforming countries with sort of significantly bigger economies and significantly bigger populations, even on this scale metric. And I think one of the reasons we sort of have thought about it this way and sort of, we might want to show it, break it down this way, is sort of its relation to sort of, I guess, the direction that AI development is going, which is sort of the rise of these like big foundational models. And I think sort of gets at this fundamental sort of question everyone's asking right now, which is the future of foundational model, large language model development, is it sort of essentially going to be a handful of like very large proprietary models sort of owned by, the big tech companies, and those ones are just better than everyone else's, and sort of everyone else has to use those models? Or actually is the future sort of this proliferation of open source, smaller models sort of that, lots of different people to come together, trained maybe on sort of smaller data sets, and actually there's sort of a growing body of research that suggests that actually bigger is not always better, and you can sort of train models on sort of smaller, curated, clean data sets and get pretty good results. And so, if it's the former, if this is actually just about size and sort of how many parameters and sort of how much data you can throw into models, then really this is a question of scale. And the US and China sort of will completely dominate. As right now, if you look at sort of the 60 largest sort of large language models, something like 40 are sort of American, 10 are Chinese, and then sort of there's a few other ones from different countries. But really, it's sort of the really big ones. Sort of they're models that come out of the big tech companies. So Google, OpenAI. Meta, and then in China, sort of Baidu, Huawei, and sort of those companies dominate. But actually, if the future of development is going to be about sort of open source and sort of smaller models, then suddenly the US and China's position isn't sort of unassailable anymore. Actually, sort of these countries around here, sort of the UK, Switzerland, Germany, have sort of a fighting chance, because it's not just about scale at that point. It's about sort of how dynamic is your AI ecosystem? Can you spin up sort of AI research labs, or have you got sort of open, curated data sets available in your country? And there's really a niche there for sort of development of what we might call sort of national or sovereign foundation models. So sort of models that are sort of maybe, trained on the native language of a country, not English, models that sort of particularly fine-tuned to like the political, regulatory, cultural sort of niche of a country. So, we definitely don't have an answer to that question of sort of which way are things going to end up going, but hopefully we can sort of track that change across time with the index and sort of see whether sort of it is the US and China sort of lock in their lead, or whether actually we're going to see a big opening up in the next few months as we see sort of open source efforts to replicate the really big models. I could probably go on, but I think at this point I'm going to hand to James and our speakers.
I'm quite up for going on. Can we just do two things, Joe, just before we finish, or bring Richard, Catherine, and Tim in? Just we've done this year the generative AI, the sort of mini index, right? And I just wondered what you thought, that right at the back, if you have a look. What do you think that tells you? Or I don't know, sorry, who's best on that?
So I think if you look at that generative AI index right now, what it tells you is actually it is sort of a scale thing, and it's the US and China. And the US is really, really dominant on the investment side. And actually, it's not just the investment, it's not just the training of these really big models. It's actually sort of the underlying cutting edge research. Again, it's the US and China sort of have a really significant jump, or sort of the papers coming out of them, or sort of the people sort of filing patents to say we're going to use this technology for X purpose. It's really currently that index, which sort of looks a bit more broadly at generative AI, is sort of leaning towards the scale hypothesis, I think.
Okay.
But I think that is something that we will see change, well, possibly in the next 18 months. That's sort of something to watch.
Okay. I think we'll come into it, hopefully, Rich, we can get into this, because I feel like there's some quite interesting things about clusters of research and the impact of that research, and also clusters of investment and the power of those. So we'll come to that in a second. And then, sitting as we are in Rishi Sunak's global superpower of AI, what would you advise the government to learn from Singapore? Because anyone looking at that would think they must be doing something right.
Actually,
yeah, I think that's a very good question, and I think from Singapore, what the UK can learn is both investing in innovation and in the research and development phase of AI growth. And Singapore has really been putting a lot of efforts into looking at whether and how the country could develop AI. So there is a word in Singaporean English and Chinese that I can't remember right now, but it's a word to talk about how important it is for Singaporean culture to take caution and to slow down before entering into something. And I think I was actually talking to someone about this in relation to our AI index. And I think what the UK can do in this sense is taking a similar approach and really boosting the research and innovation and patents on AI to boost growth. And yeah, I think this is the main thing.
Yeah.
But the UK, in terms of investment, like I said earlier, is doing really, really well. So it is still attracting a lot of investment for artificial intelligence, despite the policies and the government efforts maybe not being as strong and as comprehensive.
Yeah. I hope that people will stick around and kind of drill Joe and Serena for some of the details. I also want to say thank you, not just for the amount of work. I know that you've barely been outside for half a year. But the thing that makes me very proud, and I'm sure that people when they read the report will kind of pick up on this, is that it's very, very tempting when you get a big data set just to plug it in and go, well, that's good. That tells us lots of stuff. And actually, when I look at what we've done or what you've done, what I think we try to do is think to the next level. Well, oh yes, these number of research papers may suggest this clustering of research and innovation, but actually there's a difference between the number of papers published and the number of papers then cited. Let's look at relevance and impact as well. And we try and do that, and that requires a good deal of kind of thoughtfulness in the weeds. So a big thank you to you both. Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Serena. Thank you very much. There's a question we ask at news conference at 11:30 here, which tends to be who's responsible? Richard, Catherine, Tim. I'm afraid it's going to fall to you. So Richard Davis is there. I hope I get this right. Richard is the head of data at Ofcom.
Chief Data Officer, yeah.
Chief Data Officer, which means responsible for not Ofcom's data, but data overall and handling of data in the UK.
Not the whole of the UK, but within Ofcom we have obviously the converged regulator for communications, and within that we are ingesting a lot of data ourselves and using that to inform our regulatory practices, how we can ingest and use that data effectively to inform our regulation, but then also how we understand the data practices of the companies that we regulate and how, as that's changing significantly, how do we understand that and build that capability from a regulatory point of view?
And Catherine Holden, if I've got this right, you're the head of data analytics overseeing AI and digital identity at Tech UK.
Yes, absolutely. A busy time.
Yeah.
Sure.
So presumably you and Richard are kind of in the same part of the ever-changing forest.
Yes, there's certainly overlap, particularly on the bits around AI regulation, which obviously is going to become increasingly important over the next sort of 12 to 18 months. But a lot of the work we do at Tech UK, which for those who don't know, Tech UK, largest technology trade association here in the UK. We've got about 1,000 members in membership, from those big FTSE 100s all the way down to those smaller startups and scale-ups. It's very much looking at how do we ensure the UK is a place where this technology can flourish, and how do we get there? And obviously there's multiple different strands to that, which I'm sure we'll get into detail.
And then Tim and I have known each other for a while, but as a partner at Best Practice AI, I imagine also a busy time. And I should declare also a fellow board member with me on Full Fact. Full Fact is going to get busier too, I suspect. But let's start simply with just your impressions of what you've heard. Richard, you go first. So what?
So firstly, I just want to say a big thank you again for the team that's done this. It's for me, looking at something that's got the data and the information that's there to be able to present the evidence in a way that you can drill into it and really find out the information is useful to see where we are and where the learnings that we can have from that. And I've spent the last weekend, as we had the information sent to us, drilling into this and really going through where different countries are operating. The thing that was calling out to me, I was having a discussion with the team earlier around this as well, is the part of the implementation bracket around the operating side and what that means. And there's some countries that are doing really well on that, and the others that might be doing really well on their investment side and the research and development, but then falling a little bit when it comes to the operating index. And drilling into that, it's about as was described, the public perception, but then also the operating process and the patents and the information that's coming through there. For me, this is then say, how do we start to understand that environment that companies and researchers, academics can work in to be able to take advantage of AI changes, both from like the large language models that you're seeing and general AI. And how do you start to move faster with that? And I think this is something that we'll talk about more, there's a large part of this that then says, how do you use regulation more effectively to enable people to move faster? I've heard the analogy quite a few times of racing cars and brakes, and it's not necessarily the size of an engine. If you've got a massive engine on a car and you're moving as fast as you can, you're just going to career off the side of the track the moment that you hit a corner. Having the brakes is a thing that makes you drive faster around the track. And the regulations enable us to be able to do that, to be able to say how having effective regulations that people understand, the guardrails in place, enables everyone to be able to take advantage of it. And I think that's the bit where we can start to see some of the advantages and potentially some of the discrimination between countries in terms of who's got the better regulations that companies can understand and the guardrails that presents.
Could we come back to that specific
Absolutely.
issue? I think it'd be a really good one. Catherine, what do you make of it?
Well, again, first of all, I would like to echo thanks for this. I think maybe it's very nerdy of me, but I particularly like this kind of annual review where, we can really see what the lay of the land is. And I really sort of appreciate that, particularly from a policy perspective. I think it really demonstrates that countries are at extremely different stages when it comes to AI and its adoption. And actually, I think there is definitely a need for considerable international cooperation and interoperability, particularly around international standards, as and when these companies are developing their governance systems. A few kind of observations for me. I thought it was fascinating that Singapore has just sort of leapt up so dramatically in quite a short space of time. For me, talking to a lot of our members, the thing they quite like about Singapore is they have been very pioneering with developing this, what is called an AI governance testing toolkit called AI Verify, which basically allows companies to test their systems within sort of a safe regulatory environment that's been set up by the public sector to be able to basically determine and kind of get a stamp of approval that their technology is deemed responsible. Very innovative. No other government's done that before, so I think that's really key. But interestingly as well, Singapore has kind of come out. You mentioned about how they're sort of kind of watching how everything's happening and taking quite a slow approach. They have been quite explicit in the fact that they're not looking to regulate AI anytime soon, which I think is an interesting observation when we're seeing lots of other countries, really trying to scrap together to make sure that they've got clear regulation in this area as soon as possible. I think another one that's worth watching is India. I think, talking to a lot of my members, India is definitely a country that, looking in 12 months' time, we may see them rise up the ranks for sure as well. I know that sort of social empowerment and inclusivity is very much part of their sort of plan for growth within their organisation, within their company, and within the country more broadly. And they've obviously got an incredibly young workforce and are doing lots of work to try and upskill that workforce and make sure that they are ready for the AI revolution. And they're doing, again, some dramatic work around opening up public data sets as well, which, I think actually here in the UK we could learn a lot from. So lots and lots of interesting stuff. I'd also like to see maybe if we know a lot of work's happening in Europe at the moment. If you were to cluster a lot of those European countries together, how they would work alongside, or where they would rank themselves alongside some of those bigger players as well. Because obviously we know in Europe they are making dramatic sort of strides with their EU AI Act, which we expect to be sort of published by the end of the year, and one of the first sort of, I guess, well-established pieces of regulation and legislation globally. So I could talk forever, but there's just some ideas.
Much here. This is unbelievable. I've got to say, because I read all this stuff, and you just listen to you, Catherine, you think, okay, what is the answer? Is the answer toolkits that are a stepping stone to licensing, or a free-for-all? Let's see where we are in a couple of years. Okay, we'll come back to all that second. Tim.
I think the best thing you can say about how important this index is when Rishi Sunak was in Washington a few weeks ago, arguing for the UK to host a big global AI safety conference. He kept referring to the UK as the number 3 player in the world. Now, where did he get that? Other than probably from you guys. So you've built something here that is really impressive. You continue to build it. That's a really big impact on the world. Clearly, he's been a little bit upset you're now number 4, but nonetheless, it's still something.
He got him just under the wire.
He got him just under the wire. But he'll probably quote the generative AI being number 3 as being the key thing. Yeah. I think what's interesting you've done this time is you've brought in that scale versus intensity mix. And so almost you draw out actually the real choice for the UK, which is, do we go for scale? Are we a sort of country that claims to be big enough? And clearly we can't compete with China or the US, and we sort of rejected that by not being part of the EU anymore. Or do we go for basically living the Brexit dream, which is what Singapore is doing, which is being super fast and super snappy and doing all sorts of cool things? And you've pulled out the stuff they're doing around, for example, AI Verify and the tools they've worked on. We worked a bit with them in the World Economic Forum on that. And they've been doing that for a while. It's been a big investment. But also, for example, they're saying that in terms of generative AI LLM tools, they're freeing up all the copyright rules. So the whole sort of question around what you can and can't do in terms of training those models, they're just freeing that up in a way that makes it far, far smoother. And it would encourage people, therefore, to come and do stuff in Singapore they might not otherwise do. I think India's originally one in terms of the other one, the scale side. India is a sleeping giant of AI. And you look at your generative AI tool, they're already number 7. And at the same time, you look at, for example, just in AI in banking, India has got the second most people in the world working in AI and banking just behind the US. So you're clearly in a place now where India's got vast volumes of talent, and all they need is to begin to get that to a better place. And I fully agree with you, India is going to be, if you think about, the thing that comes to me is the thing about AI is, are you all in on AI or not all in on AI? China is all in on AI. If you're the Chinese Communist Party and you're looking at the world, you've got 3 big issues. One is you have to get rich before you get old. And clearly, AI is one of the ways you're going to drive that massive increase in productivity to get there. Second thing, you have a whole social control issue. How do you keep your country in a place where the Communist Party is in control, whether it's the social scoring or the facial stuff? AI is core to that. And third is you're looking externally, you're going, how do we counter the US 7th Fleet in the South China Sea? You want a military revolution. AI is core to that. So China is all in on AI. China's become an absolutely quintessential thing for them. Singapore, at a different scale, probably is as well. They realize this is a way a small country can punch above its way to the world. The challenge for mid-sized countries like the UK, France, Germany, and so on is, are we all in on this thing? Are we not all in on this thing? And how do we actually play at a bigger place? And so we're stuck between those two sort of scale versus intensity choices, and that's a really big challenge for us in the UK.
Okay, I'm gonna have a go at driving things towards 3 or 4 things, but they may be the wrong ones. So please just catch my eye and say, no, let's talk about something else. Just to let you know, I'd love to pick up, Richard, on your point about regulation and guardrails. I'm interested in the UK because I'm here, and your point about who's all in. I think there's a kind of talent / infrastructure question which seems that's within the reach of government, and there's a kind of investment. And Jess, what would you?
And the translation, we've got some of the best universities in the world. What's the kind of, how do we make the most of that, which is something special?
Okay, you don't only get to speak if I previously worked with you, Jessica Cecil, and I worked at the BBC, so do just say. Richard, but please do exactly as Jessica, just kind of catch my eye and we'll get into it. Can I start with the regulation point? So when we've looked at this, and when I looked at the sort of notes we come to at the end, I come away with a much more anxious view of government, Ofcom, and the UK. And for this reason, Richard, if you look at the back of the book, right, and you look, for example, just at the little generative AI point, right, what it paints for me is a picture, right, I think the very, very back page, we've got a paragraph which spells out, if I've got it right, spells out where the investment in generative AI comes and in terms of which companies. And I think it says 70+% of those companies are in the US, right? And I can see a version of the world in which not only are we rule takers in a global economic sense, we're rule takers from private companies that themselves aren't regulated. And so I don't see how, if you're sitting in Ofcom thinking we need to create a regulatory structure for companies that are not domiciled in the UK and not subject to meaningful regulation even in their own domestic economy, what chance we have of regulating AI in a way that meaningfully impacts us already?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's certainly one that you'll see being tackled as part of the online safety bill as well, and much broader as that's being debated. I think one thing I'd say is it's not just Ofcom. This is the AI white paper is going a lot broader. And to that extent, there's a lot that we're doing with the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, so DRCF, which is working with the ICO, the CMA, FCA, as we're looking at the wider consequences of the digital impact that has for consumers and how we can make sure that people are protected. To be able to look at that is then looking at across a number of areas, from the privacy angle, from the ICO, from the markets angle, from the CMA, how that impacts on the financial regulations, and as well how that's going to have the wider impact around communications. So for us, that's how do we work really effectively to be able to say the impact that the white paper is going to have, how we're responding to that white paper can impact what we're looking to do. But I think it needs to go much broader than this. I think one of the issues that I'd see is if every country was going off and saying its own AI standards, its own AI regulations, we'd have regulatory divergence and the issues that would have. And I think we need to see a lot more cooperation, and this has already started. I know an event that Catherine had recently with the CDI, there was members from the OECD that were talking there, and the catalogue, the tools that they have for AI assurance, for being able to understand how areas of safety, transparency, fairness, governance, redress, the 5 principles that were set up in the AI white paper, can be looked at and investigated through systems. I think trying to look at that from an international lens, setting up some standards internationally and how those relate back to where we are, will enable us to have safer systems more broadly. So it's not just what can the UK do? It could be how the UK can lead on this area, but we need to be working cooperatively and internationally, because the companies that are working in this area are, as you say, huge. They're supranational. They are working across boundaries, and it won't take the effort of one company to say, how do we enable people to use these tools safely?
And Rich, just on that regulatory divergence point, listening to you, it sounds as though you come out more on we need global cooperation to deal with global powers in AI, including private companies, rather than regulatory divergence is a competitive advantage. It means we can set rules in our own economy. You see where I'm going with this?
Yeah, and I think so you need to have local implementation of it. I think if you look at like the Hofstadter cultural dimensions or anything like that, where you're saying every country is going to have their own cultural norms that will be looking at saying how is AI can be used safely within their own country. There will be certain nuances based on the cultures of those individual countries. You've been hearing from Singapore, their approach, and there's obviously a European version of that, and there's been a UK interpretation of what cultural norms and what safety needs to look like within the UK. So there will be slight divergences, but I think alongside that, you need to be setting up international standards that can be followed so that you can understand what does a transparent system for AI look like. And until you've got the standards across a number of different algorithms that are being used, you won't be able to drill down into that to say, how does a consumer understand what decisions are being made about them, the products that are being advertised to them, the information that's being displayed on recommender systems or whatever it will be. How do we understand the choices that are being made on our behalf by these systems? That transparency needs to work at an international level.
Of course, yeah. Catherine, this is embarrassing. I can't read my own handwriting. In fact, I'm thinking I'm not sure there'll ever be an AI that's going to be able to do that either. Singapore's AI something toolkits.
Yes, AI Verify, yeah.
Okay,
yes.
So can you just explain that? Because the reason it seems interesting to me is that you say on the one hand, Singapore's not saying it's going ahead with regulation, but it sounds as though it's creating a framework that, if I understand correctly, kite marks responsibility in the development of different AIs.
Yes, broadly, and again, there's probably others in the room that are have more expertise on this. But my understanding is it is an AI governance tool. So it's basically through a series of sort of technical standards, companies can kind of submit. Well, this is kind of our due diligence. This is the way in which we are creating this AI technology. This is the way it's being deployed, and it's being sort of fairly assessed against these critical standards that have been, technical standards that have been developed by government. And from that, they kind of receive a sort of yes, that this is we deem this sort of responsible AI. But yes, you're right. That I guess is covering off one important area, but in terms of how that technology then goes on to be regulated, that's an area that they're not looking at the moment. And I think for the time being, we'll look at what existing regulation exists in this space and using that before adding any additional measures.
So the reason, just on this regulatory point, that I'm intrigued by that is how do you do forward-looking regulation?
It's, well, really, really difficult, particularly in AI, which is obviously moving at such considerable pace and at such scale. I mean, we at Tech UK are fairly supportive of the UK's proposed approach, which has come out in the UK AI white paper that was published in March. And that's because it's risk-based, it's context-specific, and it's essentially looking at regulating the outcomes of AI technologies rather than the technology itself. And obviously that will be down to the responsibilities of the individual regulators to determine what within their own sectors they think is high risk and where maybe future guidance or possible regulation is necessary. Now that's quite contrasting to what's happening in Europe, where they are looking through the EU AI Act, they're looking at basically regulating a definition of AI, which has already come up with a series of problems because obviously in the advent of generative AI, they kind of produced this regulation, and have been developing it over the last 12 to 18 months. With the advent of generative AI, that's thrown up a whole series of questions and considerations that they hadn't put into their initial piece of legislation, and they've had to basically go back to the drawing board and redraft their legislation and their regulation in this space. So I think that is a key example of showing why the UK's approach, I think, if funded appropriately and if kind of implemented effectively, could help to be the answer in terms of ensuring that regulation keeps apace with the technology developments in this space.
What do you think, Tim?
In terms of?
Well, I'm intrigued by this idea of the white paper point about regulating future outcomes, because this is like a sort of BBC kind of refugees therapy session. But the interesting thing for me when I arrived at the BBC was understanding what happened in 1922-23 when they essentially licensed the technology of broadcasting. They basically said, look, here is a technology which is so powerful it can control the life of the mind. We don't trust individuals or private companies to hold it. We're going to license you. And then against that license, they essentially set a bunch of requirements in terms of outcomes. Right, so public service broadcasting doesn't regulate against what you've done, it regulates for what you will do. And so the reason that I'm interested in this, it feels as though we're muddling our way towards a similar mindset in which we say, look, we're going to put the onus on the developers of the AI. It's not as stringent as a licensing mechanism, but it does, if you're on the board of an AI company, what this says to me is that sooner or later government is going to say to you, you are responsible for the future outcomes of your AI. I don't know how the hell they do that, but it seems to me as though that's the direction of travel, because it's not possible for Ofcom to retrospectively regulate on AI. And so that's what I'm trying to get at. Tim, what do you think of that?
I mean, I just think we're watching a shift in power in AI from the power of the individual to the power of capital. And the state is about to get involved and pile stuff in. So you've got all this from the first generation of great minds, the Jeff Hintons of this world, sort of going, whoa, what's happened? And actually you've now got someone like OpenAI saying, we're going to deploy $10 billion, we're going to make this thing transform the world. So you've got this concentration of power coming to these deep pools of capital. And those are at the moment corporate, but they'll increasingly in the future be state-based. So I do think that means you have to be pretty aggressive in how you regulate this stuff. And I think I'd also say that actually globally, I think the regulatory bodies are moving far faster than they usually do. So the US Senate hearings into this type of stuff has been far more well thought through, better questions, far more sort of self-educational than, for example, their rather embarrassing hearings about Facebook were, 5 or 6 years ago. And so you can see that I think you've got a whole generation of regulators who are really looking at this and going, wow, we're really worried about it. We need to do something about it. And I don't think we yet know the answer. This is moving at such pace and it's changing so fast. But I also think you've got to think about the various places in the stack. So you've got the LLMs, which clearly are, the question you rightly brought out, which is going to be open source, is it going to be centralized? I think as the cost of the stuff comes down, that entire economic story is going to be, it's almost, the economics will be as important as the regulation. Because once you get to a place where the marginal cost of delivering the stuff is close to zero, it's going to be very hard for new players to get into the space. And so I think a lot of stuff is going to move to that world quite quickly. So you need to think about how you regulate that. And there's a busy, so if you watch the sort of the lobbying behind the European Parliament stuff recently, all these players are trying to pass responsibility around. So OpenAI are trying to say, no, it's the end user who matters. And they've come through with probably an overcomplicated approach to say, no, actually, the current technical people are responsible. So I think it's that sort of that transition between, are you going for the risk-based thing, or are you trying to regulate tech that is moving very fast, where the economics are probably more important than the regulation in terms of how that works out?
Yeah, sorry, Richard, you want to?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting point that Tim raises, and it's about the changing applications that we see within AI itself. And this is kind of going back to Catherine's point around how the EU Act is working in that regard. In the past, we've had models that you could build. So I've been building these models for a very long time. Some I coded myself. Then over time, you're able to go to a library and say, I'll download this model and I'll apply it to an area. If I'm not using that area in something that's a business front or a application that's going to be regulated by current regulation, it currently wouldn't be regulated. We're now in a position where certain companies are now producing large language models or other AI, which is going to be open and available to people. And there's that question of where do you place the burden of regulation? It could be on the end use, it could be on the thing that's going to be public facing. We're seeing a lot more of this kind of capability for no-code environments where people are accessing the AI tools without being able to code. ChatGPT is a good example of that. But then you get to a point where you've also then got foundational models. A foundational model is something that lies underneath at the lower end of the stack, which someone can then take and say, how do I now fine-tune this for my application? And my application might then be put out into the consumer front end, and every single area of that could be regulated in different ways. And this is where there's the huge understanding of how this stuff works, and it's complex.
Yeah.
It's really complex. And this is one thing I say, and we might get back to this in terms of talent. I want to see, and we've started to build up in the regulatory point of view, more teams of people who have this deep understanding of the technology landscape, who are experts in AI, machine learning, who've been developing it themselves and are able to see what that means to be able to understand where the flaws are and the risks are as you move through this different ecosystem of foundational models to fine-tuning to applications, and say where can the risks be present across each of those, and where can that influence the harms that consumers see.
Let's come back in a second to the end user. But Tom, can I play you in? Tom, I want to play you in, if I might, just because this conversation about talent. But those people who don't know, Tom worked in Downing Street on the security side for a while. But we've talked ever since we got started, really, about where is the talent, who really knows what. And I'm just interested to know, like, when you look at this, what you think on a granular basis for the UK, but also I was interested to see that one of the findings is that China isn't doing as well on talent as I sort of thought it would. So just how you see things.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Tom Hurd. I'm Chief Executive of Zeki Research. We track and evaluate deep tech talent globally. So that would include all kind of AI talent. I was formerly head of Homeland Security in the UK, so I spent a lot of time working on the online safety bill.
Yeah.
So I would say on India, the risk for India is that they lose their best talent to the States. Particularly those sort of PhDs and postdocs that are at the cutting edge of innovation. When you look at sort of talent in banks, yes, lots of AI talent in India working for the financial sector, but they're doing quite low-end DevOps work, I would say. They're not at the sort of cutting edge. Singapore actually, I think, has done a very good job in growing organically its own talent. It has hired in some people from outside, but actually you see, emerging sort of, organic talent coming through, which is very, very impressive. China, I think there's a very big picture. I think what Tim said is very interesting on the three priorities for China, but AI poses a tension for them between their priority of public order and their priority of productivity. And they've chosen public order as their priority. And so they did, dare I say it, and I think this does, in the regulatory terms, they did slam on the brakes in terms of AI and investment in AI. And I think that's had a chilling effect on investment and research and over the last couple of years. And that reflects actually the sort of drop in AI in the index. I agree. I think in the UK, the issue is of course regulatory, and we're kind of stuck in the middle. But there's a really boring but important problem, which is access to computing power and to GPUs that allow you to do this stuff. So we use LLMs at the moment, but you have to go to Microsoft and say, can we have access to your GPU? And they say, you're in the queue. And remember, LLMs also take up an enormous amount of energy. There's a vast amount of compute energy that is going to be used. So these things around energy and who actually has access to these bottleneck technologies at the moment are big issues. One last final point on regulation, and I've worked in this area a lot. I love the idea that you need to build your own research base. The regulator really needs to get close to the technology. And actually, that's, I think, an area where UK is in a very good place. You've got Turing Institute, you've got lots of really good universities where there's lots of fantastic talent. So that's an area where I'm hopeful that we can show thought leadership.
Are there other points of view just before I come back to Tim and Catherine and Richard? Yes.
I'm worried. I'm worried in general when I hear discussion in this area and other areas of data is that the conversation is dominated by personal data, and the risks are dominated by risk to the person. So I work at the Open Data Institute, and there's a lot of defaulting of considering data regulation as GDPR, when the value to be accessed and the changes that can be made with let's call it industrial data, are vast and overlooked because of the sort of the trapped nerve of the personal data issue.
Interesting. And sorry, just explain it so I'm being dozy. The risk there is what to industries and the conduct of those industries, or to the public square? What are we missing?
Policy. So we see a very interesting project going on in the Home Office, for example, looking at digital identities, so that people can have access, people can have access to services through a single identity. And they're building a sort of data infrastructure about personal identity, which is appropriate. But I don't think we're seeing the same level of infrastructure being considered for data which is not personal.
Interesting. Okay. Catherine, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, no, I would completely agree. I guess the main reason we've been focusing on personal data is just because of the high risk nature that is associated, and also just from a political and kind of public perspective, that is the areas where people are most fearful in terms of how their data will be used and potentially abused. So that's, I think, my main point on that.
There was, who else had a hand up?
Yeah.
Did I miss someone? Yes, sir.
Yeah, Simon Green from Best Practice here. It's really interesting stuff. The conversation very quickly goes to regulation.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And the different comparisons. But what about the other side, which is the demand side? How much adoption is going on in industry and business? Because ultimately that would define sort of the success of the UK. And I'm just wondering if you can comment on where do we sort of compare to the rest of the world in terms of sort of AI adoption?
Yeah. I mean, from my perspective, I think the UK definitely punches above its weight. I've been working at Tech UK for 5 years now, and the interest in AI and what it could do for companies of all shapes and sizes has ramped up to this unprecedented scale that I have never seen before. I think when it comes to generative AI, though, as an example, and I know the UK is currently looking like they're ranking number 3 in this, I'm definitely seeing that we're starting to see some of our larger members who obviously have the capacity and the resources to invest in this area progressing at pace, while some of our other members, like slightly smaller ones, are just sort of taking stock and trying to recognise, is this an area that they want to, as you said, sort of invest in wholeheartedly and actually, throw a lot of money behind, or actually are there suitable solutions that exist within the market that they can just procure and take off the shelf? So maybe a slight reluctancy around the adoption of generative AI, but AI more broadly, I think the benefits that are associated with the technology are now well recognised, and I certainly am starting to see a huge appetite within the UK in terms of adoption.
Yeah, thanks, yeah, sorry, Lexi. I should, by the way, while you pass the thing over, I must just say something. On the weekend, I said to a friend of mine and I were talking about AI, and I was like, well, how fast do you think it stops? And he said, once you start, you can't stop. So I wrote, and I said, what's the point of Tortoise, right? ChatGPT writes, the value of slow news lies in its ability to provide deeper context, nuanced analysis, and a more comprehensive understanding of complex issues, allowing readers to make informed decisions and engage in meaningful conversations. I thought I'd been trying to figure this out for 5 years. It's incredible. Alexi.
Yeah, I know we talked a lot about regulation, but probably that's reflective of the fact that this debate isn't just a commercial debate, it's got huge social social implications as well. And I was reading a potentially unfair piece in TechCrunch the other day on the AI white paper, which drew a comparison between the principles-based approach of the UK and the legal-based approach of the EU. And it said, without a legal framework to turn these principles into hard rules, it looks about as useful as whistling the Lord's Prayer and hoping for the best if it's trustworthy AI you're looking for. So, in a sense, are we sort of moving closer towards the Singapore model of let's go for innovation, let's just let everything kind of focus around commercial interests? And are any of you worried about the potential kind of moral and ethical implications of having a less than a legal-based approach going forward?
As well as opening up an interesting angle on the best ways to communicate with God, what do you think, Tim, of that?
I mean, I think we're kind of underplaying some of the broader risks in this country. The UK is really good economically at using language in all sorts of ways. We're good at law, we're good at education, we're good at journalism, we're good at marketing. Generative AI is a homing missile coming for the UK economy. Everything we've got competitive advantage in, generative AI is coming for it. Now, that's potentially a big opportunity. The UK can go out there and say, okay, we can make the cost of doing law far cheaper, and we'll take the cost of our magic circle law firms down by 50%. That can move them from servicing 1,000, 10,000 companies to servicing 1 million companies globally. It's a big economic opportunity here. I'm afraid to disagree with you. I don't think the UK is grabbing this opportunity. If you look at the US, S&P and so 500 or so, half the value of that is all in on AI. It's a big tech platform. So JP Morgan Chase, there's Massey Ferguson. These big corporates are going, this is a thing we have to really zero in on. I struggle to name any British companies where you can say the same thing about. Rolls-Royce and the margins and so on, various places. So I think we have a real fundamental issue in this country, which is we don't have corporates leaning into this. Evan and AI did a whole bunch of work on banking and index. The US corporates are massively leaning into this. The UK companies are all way behind. And you can clearly see this being repeated in industry sector after industry sector. And maybe it's because our stock exchange is all mining companies and so on. But you look at the ability of this country to deliver IPOs, to deliver value, and we have a real problem. And so I think we have a real structural challenge, and it's a risk to your problem, which goes beyond the personal to a risk to the entire economy we operate in.
Can I just get that right, Tim? Did I get it right? Law, education, did you say banking and journalism?
Law, education, marketing, journalism.
Okay.
Everything's about taking the English language.
Yeah.
We have a competitive advantage to the English language.
But
generative AI potentially
go
blows
for
that
that.
away. Because suddenly everyone can translate at zero cost.
All right, well, let's end here, because I'm going to try and make sure we get away at 9:30. Catherine, Richard, the UK.
Goodness, yes. The UK, just in general, what's
The UK,
final
what
thoughts?
What do you do, to help Rishi achieve his global AI superpower?
I'll keep it short because I know we've not got time. But I think, first thing, just on your point about the UK AI white paper, I think the approach, if implemented sort of successfully and at pace, so we put the money behind it to ensure that the regulators have the capacity and the capability to regulate in their area effectively, we've got a good approach that can be robust and that can be flexible. And it is, it does take a hard stance on areas which are considered indeed high risk. So I think first and foremost is resourcing the regulators to do the job effectively in order to enable the AI white paper to be successful. And the second point is we can't do this in isolation. We need international cooperation and interoperability. And that starts with international standards. And we should use the OECD's AI principles as the basis for that discussion.
Thank you. Richard?
Yeah, I'll probably come into, we talked about regulation, but for me, while we need to be able to do this safely, I think there's a huge opportunity, and it goes to what Tim's saying. We have got certain areas where we have competitive advantage in the UK, and I think we need to then be leaning into the capabilities that we can have, and that's about the talent profile, how we can be building that up, but more than just talent profile. We've got great universities, as you say, amazing universities that are doing fantastic research, and I'm working with a load of them in terms of how we're doing that. But I think the next bit is then saying, how do we get the knowledge transfer to industry? How do we build that up? How do we look at growing patents and being able to do that? That's one of the areas that the index shows that we're not as good on as other countries. So we need to be much better, and this then goes into taking to the next step was the IPOs that we then get from that. And I think that whole section of taking the fantastic universities we've got and growing the opportunity set within the areas that we have a competitive advantage is a huge capability boost that we can do that. My hope is that by having good guardrails, safe regulation enables that to happen faster. And some of the things that we can look at from a data asymmetry point of view, where at the moment, huge concentration of data that drives all these models is held by few companies. How do we get that? Probably goes to Open Data Institute, more open, more into people's hands, again, in a safe way. What can we do with government regulatory sandboxes to enable companies to innovate fast, safely, and get some of these capabilities out? I think doing that, we have the opportunity within the UK to grow in a fantastic way.
So thank you. It's 9:30. I know it's just the beginning of the day. It feels like there's a long day ahead of us now. I want to just finish, if I can, with an ask and a thank you. The ask is this. I have to confess, I've got really frustrated sort of intensely in the last probably quite recent period of time, 6-12 weeks, with the sort of clambering of one news organization over another to tell us that the end of the world is nigh. It seems like it was 2050 and now it's kind of Wednesday at 4 p.m. It just keeps coming closer. And one of the things that we're trying to do is see whether or not there's an appetite to do, as we found at Tortoise, one of the kind of things that came to us by mistake, or possibly courtesy of Alexi Mostras here, is the power of podcasting. We hadn't realized that it was a way of getting to such large numbers of people the kind of journalism that we really care about, which is understanding. And if you look at AI specifically, it's an incredible example of how bulletin-based or story-based journalism doesn't work. But if you gave yourself 12 episodes of half an hour each to really understand AI and take your points and go, okay, let's really understand adoption, or let's really understand talent. And instead of just doing kind of, Cassandra News, you might have something to. We'd love to see if we could do a series called Making Sense of AI. And if there are partners here who'd be interested in working with us on that, we'd really like it. I think it's one of those things that has a kind of evergreen quality to it because it's journalism, but it would last for a long time. I think people would listen to it over time. So if anyone's interested, come and call me. I'm interested in that. And then a thank you. We are still 4 years into this. It's still relatively early days. Actually, Richard and Catherine and Tim and all the teams who've helped our teams make sense of this data, it really means a lot to us. It is really complicated, and for a small news company, a daunting thing to do. And so not only for just coming this morning, but actually for helping us in this whole process, I wanted to say a big thank you. There are lots of people in this room who've also made that possible, so thank you to you. And most importantly, don't leave without cleaning us out of croissants. It would be a shame to waste them. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.